going to say, actually, usually I'm quite allergic to this sort of stuff, but I might try it.
I'm not.
I'm not allergic. Okay. But I'll be alright with it.
You're alright with sugar?
Yeah. Well, usually there's something about it, but I'll be okay with it. I'll try it. Anyway. And you're going to be reading from Blood Feast. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Joseph Lacey.
You're right. So I'm going to read a short excerpt after these two rather longish stories, and this is not a chapter at all. It's just. Do you want some water, mate? Oh. Okay, and. Okay, so really this is a quick chapter, and it's an action scene where a posse is going into the woods to search for some teenagers that have gone missing, and they find themselves in a bit of a difficult situation. So our two characters are Randall. Jeez.
Sorry, I'm really sorry.
Jasper, do you want to just...
I'm okay.
Just, do you want to just go ahead?
Sorry.
Just go out for a second, you're right.
Yeah, so.
I used to think I missed all the good parties.
Right, I hope it's going to be okay. I think he did say he's got a thing about sugar, so I just hope it'll be okay. So I'm going to get on with this chapter and hope that Jasper returns. Okay. Randall stared at the strewn clothes and wondered what they might mean for the girl who'd worn them. Was she dead? Raped? Just crazy? You know, Flowers, he said, I think we should go a little further along here and see if we can find her. Maybe she's hurt. I don't think so, Mr. Moore. We're meant to stay with this stuff until the sheriff gets here. Shit, boy, when did you ever listen to instructions? You coming or not? Flowers looked down at the clothes, particularly the underwear, as if he wanted nothing more than to be left alone with them for a little while. That settled the matter for Randall. You're coming with me. Let's go. Wait, one of us should make sure this stuff is safe. It'll be safer without you, Panty Boy. Come on. Randall had to push Flowers away from the discarded clothing and get him started up the trail. Even then, Flowers kept looking back. Randall shoved him along without pretending to be nice about it. Keep your eyes open, Flowers. We're looking for a naked girl. After that, the guy started to concentrate like he was in an exam. Randall checked his watch. It would take the sheriff at least half an hour to arrive. He figured they'd walk for 10 minutes and then turn back if they hadn't found anything. He was checking his pistol for the third time that morning when he bumped into Flowers' back. He was about to give the guy another mouthful when he saw why Flowers had stopped in his tracks. In the path, about 50 yards ahead of them, was the girl they were looking for. He recognized her from the photos they'd been given. Even from this distance, she was more striking than her picture had suggested. For a start, she was as naked as he'd predicted. The effect of this on Flowers would have been amusing if Randall hadn't been so similarly affected himself. He was standing, staring, with the pistol still in his hands, mesmerized by the naturalness of her marble-pale skin against the greens and browns of the trail and the forest beyond. She stood with her feet apart, in a posture of strength and confidence, her hands on her hips, and her head tilted a little, as if waiting or beckoning. She was so achingly seductive that he was developing a rare erection. Flowers was the first to move, but he lifted his feet like a diver in a weighted suit. Randall watched as the sapling of a man set off to help Gina Priestley. His orange hunting jacket flapped a little in the breeze, and Randall saw the bumps under the orange dayglow where the guy's shoulder bones poked upwards. He tried to shout to Flowers to tell him to hold on a second, but his throat was so dry it was stuck shut. When he tried to move his legs, he had to look down to make sure he hadn't sunk into quick mud. His feet wouldn't do what he wanted them to. It was like trying to walk through treacle. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't catch up. The girl stretched her arms out to them. Her palms were held upward, and her hands beckoned. Randall was a little closer now, and with every slow pace, he could see her shape more clearly, the curve at her waist, the strongly muscled legs and shoulders, her dark pubic triangle, the grave appeal of her breasts. Her black hair contrasted her skin so totally, she looked like an actress that had stepped from the reels of a silent movie. Flowers, looking like a hopeless sinner, fell to his knees in front of her and pressed his angular cheek against the smooth curve of her abdomen. She enfolded his head in her arms, and Randall imagined the guy inhaling the scent from her cool white skin. The girl stroked Flowers' hair with great tenderness, whilst Randall Moore was still 30 yards away and struggling to make his muscles work. She had a look of such loving tenderness on her face as she looked down that Randall was overcome with a rush of animal jealousy. He reached for his pistol. Flowers' demeanour changed from that of a man who had found salvation to that of a bear that had found honey. He turned his face towards her belly and began to kiss her below the navel. Randall wanted to tear the guy away from her and smash his face with the butt of his pistol, but he was too far away. The air around him had grown thick. His breathing became laboured. He could hear nothing through the cloying atmosphere except the sound of Flowers' tongue licking and rasping against Gina's black, coarse curls. It was impossible a sound could be so loud, but Randall could hear nothing else. Balancing perfectly, Gina wrapped one leg behind Flowers' head and drew him closer. The movement separated her legs, giving his tongue easier access to her crotch. She tightened her grip on his head, and Randall saw him react by trying to pull away a little. Her skin shimmered, giving off flashes of purple. Dark vessels pulsated beneath the surface. A tube-like tongue spilled from her mouth and snaked down towards Flowers. Everything about what was happening made Randall's erection harder. Then he saw the tongue, as if it had its own life independent of the girl, wrap around Flowers' neck and burrow through the skin of his throat. Something about the sight shocked him so deeply that for a moment he regained some control over himself. Randall was only 10 paces from there by then, and had no idea how he'd covered the distance. Soon she'd be able to reach out and touch him. He raised the pistol, and she looked up from her prey. Too physically committed to Flowers in that moment, there was nothing she could do but snarl. Randall didn't want to kill her. He didn't even want to hurt her. He had in his mind only the memory of her pale skin and dark hair perfectly placed against the background of the woods. He didn't want to destroy that image. He didn't want to damage her in any way, but she was killing Flowers, and Randall knew that if he didn't do something, it would be him next. He aimed for her foot and pulled the trigger. The earth blew open in a small dark circle beside her foot. He'd missed, but the sound of gunfire had scared her and served to startle both Flowers and himself further out of their trances. Flowers tried to scream, but Gina yanked him harder into her crotch. The stifled screaming continued, making Randall giggle at the ridiculous sound, but Gina didn't let go. She began to plasticize in front of him. Her head stretched outwards and forwards, and she grew taller. The purpleness of her skin deepened, and the veins that had merely flashed beneath the surface now bulged with diseased plasma. From her mutating skin, hollow spikes tore forth. The ones that grew from her thighs and calves entered Flowers' body, wounding him and causing his muffled screams to intensify. Other tongues sprouted like vines from her belly and underarms and flailed towards Randall, who took a step backwards. As she rose up, she unhooked her leg from around Flowers' neck, and the barbs on her calf ripped open the skin of his shoulder, pulling him over onto the ground while the tongue buried in his neck continued to feed on him. Randall's second shot shattered the toes of Gina's left foot. The middle toe broke off cleanly and was forced deep into the dirt. The two on either side were pulped by the impact, but no blood or fluid escaped. Gina let out a scream that emanated from her entire body like pressurized steam. She walked towards Randall, dragging flowers through the needle-strewn dirt. He'd recovered himself enough to clasp both hands around a tongue that was both asphyxiating him and draining his carotid artery. He squeezed it in an attempt to block the flow of blood away from his body. When that didn't work, his hands lost their grip on the tongue, and his movement began to weaken. Randall fired a third shot, this time aiming to kill. He succeeded in blowing one of the pointed tubular horns from Gina's shoulder. Again, there was no blood. She seemed able to prevent any liquid leaving her body. He aimed again, correcting his mistake and trying to compensate for the shaking of his hands. Before he could squeeze another shot off, his firing hand and the one attempting to steady it were bound up by one of Gina's tongues. It wrapped around and tightened until he felt his bones pressing through the skin. All sensation went from his fingers, and though he tried to pull the trigger again, all he managed to do was drop the gun. Gina embraced him, piercing him against her armoured body, and Randall managed the full-throated scream that Flowers had not. It was cut short by her mouth over his, as she took not only his fluids, but even the damp, muted exhalations from his lungs, and consumed them all.
Put me right at the fucking end. Talk amongst yourselves.
Well, to quote Wallace, that went as well as can be expected.
Well, that's what that was about. Damn, I'm glad I was here for that. But what am I, chopped liver?
Blood fudge, I think. We're all blood fudge beneath the skin. I think we were drinking.
Yeah, you had one.
One too many. Yes. Cheers. Stand a bit. You want to take a photograph?
You look lovely, mate.
Mm.
I look
A little bald.
So,
Usually at this juncture, we have a bit of a panel to round things up.
do we have enough time?
What's the time like, Frank?
Dan, how are we doing?
For time, we're getting quite close.
7:30.
Yeah.
We've got a couple of minutes, and then maybe do some signing and things like that.
I think so, yes. Well, one question I'd like to put to all of you, actually, probably starting with John kind of going around the circle, is that, interestingly, I think when I started writing fiction, genre fiction, like yourself, Pat, I was really drawn to imaginative fiction. I didn't really specifically see any boundaries myself, but I never really thought I'd become a horror author. I mean, I've always loved horror fiction, but it wasn't sort of a genre I thought, well, that's definitely where I'm headed. But increasingly, particularly of late, more and more of the things I've written have been totally within the horror genre. And in fact, whenever anybody asks me to do something, offers me some money, and doesn't say specifically, you've got a really funny look at it, John, and doesn't ever say says to me, what do you want to write? Strangely, the genre I always move towards is horror. But I do find myself sometimes sitting at home, and my children are playing just kind of inches away from me, and I'm writing about the most gruesome, vile things, authors being devoured on stage at readings of things. And I do wonder, why on earth am I doing this? What is it that specifically impels me to write about this sort of fiction? And I'm kind of curious, am I completely alone in this, or does it ever cross your minds?
Well, you can't be alone, can you? Because there wouldn't be these ranks of horror authors.
I mean, from my experience recently, having met more and more horror authors, genre authors, just as so many well-known comedians are depressives in their real life, horror authors are some of the nicest, happiest, most intelligent, most amusing people you could ever meet. So I guess it's that yin and yang. It has to balance out somewhere.
Yeah.
An ex-girlfriend of mine said it was my dark side coming out, but as long as it stays in my writing, I think I'm all right.
Yeah, I once took Robert Bloch out to dinner I went to this conference, and I was still working for Hallmark, and Hallmark sent me to this conference, and I had met him before at a convention. Robert Bloch considered himself a science fiction fan to the day he died, and he was just the loveliest person, you know, lovely. He was the last of the old time gentlemen, you know, and just a real professional and really a man from another age in many ways, and he was a sweetheart. He was, you know, very, very gentle, kind person who wrote, you know, about murderous rampages.
And hot school wine.
Yeah, on his desk, yeah.
But I think we keep the darkness on the page, don't we? We're constantly investigating this stuff in our heads, and then when we come out of the office, we're just normal again.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember years ago interviewing Patrick Stewart, and he was saying he just had a year where he'd been playing villain in conspiracy theory, and he played a Iago on stage, and he'd done something else where he was playing a very famous character. And he said it was actually the happiest year of his life. Probably because he channeled all of that kind of, as you say, that darkness into the character and kept it. Oh, but do you think that's one of the reasons why we as readers are also quite drawn to horror? Is it sort of, is it a sort of a conduit for those darker parts of our nature?
You know, truth is always stranger than fiction, because fiction has to make sense. And horror fiction really has to make sense. You know, there has balances have to be addressed, and if things don't come out all right, you still have to have some kind of symmetry and internal consistency to it. And when you write a horror story, you are in charge of the horror. Unlike the horror of real life, in which nobody's in charge of that, you know, and there's not much you can do about it.
Do you ever, when you're writing horror, do you ever come up against something that's just too much for you? You went, well, that's not, I can't do that, and back away from it.
Well, it's like you said, I'd never set out to be a horror author. I remember about 15 years old filling my jobs at school with what would now be flash fiction, things called The Reef and Phantom Pregnancy, all very derivative, unpleasant, vile stuff because it was written so badly. But it's obviously been an element of my work, so I've got horrific elements, but I don't set out to write horror, but it's only more recently I have. And my horror fiction has far fewer deaths, I mean, if any at all, maybe at most implied. And the one which I wrote for House of Fear, The Doll's House, that was John Oliver done the collection End of the Line, and horror stories all set in the underground. And I thought, fantastic, you know, what a great idea. Why didn't I get asked to do that one? And then he goes, John, I'd like you for my next anthology, it's haunted houses. So anyway, came up with this idea, and when I submitted it, he just had he and his wife had their first child, and I did actually send a note saying that I should warn you that this for a new father, and also I've written this since being a parent myself, and I think that is because that's what scares me most. It's what might happen to my family, my children, more than anything else.
Yeah, I have to say, taboos that come up, I don't know if you have taboos or whatever, but being a parent, there's been a few times I've been working on a piece of fiction and I planned to have a child, and there's a very specific reason behind it. But when I've actually come to sit down and write it, I've always moved away from it. It's something that personally, now I'm a parent myself, I can't go there. Is there any other areas that you have?
When I was writing Garbage Man, I'd been asked to add about 40,000 words to the text, and one of the characters initially was just someone who had had a termination, and that's all we knew. But in the extra 40,000 words, I investigated that, and the child came back to life in her dreams, and I was trying to write this before our child was born. It's because I knew I would not want to think about that afterwards. And in a way, I feel that if I'm getting close to a point where I'm having trouble dealing with what I'm writing, then I'm probably writing something that's quite interesting. And I stopped writing after about a third of the way in. I couldn't really face what I was doing, and it was only when somebody was interested in the idea that I continued. With the promise of publication. Oh well, in that case, yeah, I'll finish.
Yeah, well, write them when you're pregnant.
I think I'm the opposite, because I've put more of the sort of parental, familial stuff in since becoming a parent. So I guess it's just having experienced it myself, it's some new things wrong, because equally, being a parent is a pretty tough experience anyway, so it gives you fuel for the fire.
Yeah,
Well, before I had a kid, and I would write about evil children, they'd be evil children, and then after I had a kid, the evil children disappeared. They might have been evil, but it was because of the grown-ups, and I think it's fascinating to hear people talk about, about how becoming a parent changed you and made you writing.
Was that because you thought kids aren't evil, actually? The only reason kids go bad is because of their parents? Is that what you're thinking? Or?
Pretty much, yeah. And I don't know, no one really knows if that's necessarily true. It's like there have been cases where people have 8 kids, 7 of them are normal people and one of them is a complete psycho, who tortures squirrels and things like that. And there's too much about human nature, and that's what having a kid made me aware of,
facing your fears probably about
also facing your fears about eventually you leave them in some way. You leave them, they go off, and either you leave them to themselves, or eventually you die, and you, as you're dying, you'll be worrying about them, You'll be worrying about them, and that was, that hit me hard too. It's like one of these days he's going to grow up and he's going to know exactly what shape the world is in, and he's going to turn to me for an answer, and I'm going to say, it fucked up.
We've got a lot of instances of having fucked up, haven't we? But also, one of the things that does draw me to horror fiction, the horror fiction I like best, those where the protagonist or the people involved are caught up in some form of forbidden knowledge, something that lies outside the bounds of acceptable human behaviour, human belief, human thought, and that they're going to venture everything just to achieve this unattainable, unreachable, heretical thing, which is always a taboo that obviously that's drawn me to the medium. I'm interested, we spoke about taboos that you won't break. Are the taboos that just keep pulling you back and you haven't quite exercised, you're still drawn to?
It's like in the psychiatrist's chair, isn't it? I wouldn't want to analyse it too deeply, but a lot of my protagonists have been women in my horror fiction, whereas in my other fiction it's the absolute opposite. And it's not a conscious decision, it's just the stories that I want to tell that fits the best. I've not got some vendetta I'm trying
because
to fulfill.
As female characters in violent situations are sometimes perhaps more vulnerable, and we're dealing perhaps, I am going psychoanalysis now, aren't I, Chris? But I'm fascinated. You're dealing perhaps with the female character with your own vulnerability.
I'm not sure, because I think, again, in real life, I think I'm quite a vulnerable person, and a lot of the women I've met are the strong ones.
Yeah, actually.
Somebody else.
Pat, are there any taboos to which you're drawn time and again?
I wrote a story called Two, and in the beginning of the story, um, it sounds like there's a woman watching a man asleep, and she wants to molest him, and she has some kind of, you know, ESP, and she's going to, you know, she's being really inappropriate. It's really creepy, and then you find out that she's 12 years old, and it's not sexy, you know. It's but as it turns out, that the man's, you know, he's a jerk, and she's lost. And the thing I realized after writing that was that we very seldom think of the, you know, the unspoiled childlike as what it really is, which is primal. You know, it's like up until the age of 8, kids are polymorphous perverse. Everybody's equipment looks okay. They don't know it's inappropriate to, you know, to get aroused out in public. And in dealing with that, I thought, boy, you know, you walking a really fine line there, because you gotta be in real good control of the situation and the words, because it can spill over into the just absolute cheesy, pandering, you know, look at this, it's really dirty. You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And but at the same time, you know, it's like, if you're not going to challenge yourself, you know, why do you get up?
Yeah, but those are the things as well. Sometimes things need to be said.
Yeah.
And it's why horror fiction, because it is quite horrifying. It does push buttons. It's quite a visceral medium. Why it's often a really good place to challenge those taboos, and to why are we locking this
Yeah.
up? Why aren't we facing up to this? Because often there's probably something not quite right. But Joseph, how about you?
It's not, and there's no particular taboo. For me, it's the idea that in horror fiction we take a trip into darkness, and without wanting to come across as kind of, you know, weird or goofy or whatever, it's just the fact that I think horror writers in particular have a shamanic position, because they take a journey on behalf of other people, and they bring the story back, and then people can read that story safely. But the journey isn't always necessarily safe for the author, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And the reason people read horror, and the reason I write it, is because to investigate the shadows always endlessly fascinating, and I think it's a healthy thing to be.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. But you do mention the danger for the horror author, and we touched on before as well. The kind of when you're writing a novel, particularly if you're working to quite a tight deadline, it is quite a physically and mentally and emotionally draining act. And often you start out quite slow, and you are running like hell at the end to reach a deadline for the first draft and then the second, and so on and so forth. And that can be quite exhausting. But have you ever been slightly burnt out, or gone to really dark places that you don't want to go to again in your fiction?
I think I just have a natural burnout after every long piece of fiction is complete, and the only reason I know that is because I can't write anything afterwards. So I just have to accept that that's the end of it for a little while, and then I feel stronger and healthier again later and start again.
Well, you know, it's like after you finish a big project, you're dead inside anyway. But I just find that I take a breather, and it might be half a day, it might be half a week, and then sooner or later, you know, it's like my engine is always ticking over, you know, and I'll go to the fragment box and sort through it and see what's in there.
For me, I have to say, there's always another deadline. It's just the work keeps coming. Or you have to keep completing it, should put it that way.
You like me, you primarily depend entirely upon writing for your income. So you've always got 4 or 5 projects on the go.
Yeah.
Not because you want to, because it's just unfortunately economic necessity. I'm a bit like that. Yeah, I often have to jump. So you can't afford a burnout.
You can vary what you write. I mean, again, because I do a lot of time fiction. Moshy Monsters is the latest thing, which is obviously very different from writing half written horror novels or other fantasy stories.
That's why we write comics, don't we?
Yeah. So it's a different release, but it's always the writing.
I did some writing for Black Library. I did the novelization of Jason X.
I
Yes,
did
Black
some
Flame,
of those.
yeah.
That was for Jay.
Yeah.
Pennyface.
Yeah,
Slater.
Slater. Jay Slater.
Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah.
Just like to talk.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I worked for him.
They don't pay that great, do they?
That's a real discussion.
Yeah.
But somebody wants to ask me. It's just slipped my mind. Yeah. Do we have? Well, while I try and record the questions, do we have any questions from the floor? Anything you're desperate to ask? Other than who does my makeup?
I'll have a question.
Oh, thank you. Yes, please.
This one's specifically for Jonathan Fleet, actually.
Hello.
Like Moshi Monsters, got the word monsters in it about as far as it goes for horror.
Yeah.
Would you ever consider having two separate names to sort of be able to polarise yourself to write with?
I have wondered about that in the past. I did consider that because of people getting confused. You don't, because I have had one parent come up to me and say, "Oh, I want to buy your new book, M is for Monster," which is a short story collection that I've got. And it's one of the most perverse, obscene things I've ever written. It's called M is for Monster. It's not for kids. But I've not been successful enough yet that it's really necessitated it. I don't think.
Do you ever? One thing that often happens to me. Do you remember when you were at school and you'd be in the middle of a maths exam and I had a fabulous idea for a short story or poem, and I just think, this, and then I'd start writing the poem instead. Weirdly enough, it's usually when I write in the middle of a novel and the deadline now is thin, that I start become overcome with ideas for other projects.
Always.
Do you get a moment?
Always, yeah.
Because do you work with like notebooks, several notebooks, so you're jotting down ideas and things you need to go back and change and things, and I've got one for ideas which just they flow out of me in the middle of a project. And I'm always desperate to write something else when even if this has been a dream project and I've been dying to do it for months.
That's true. Yeah, very much the same.
Yeah, that killer idea for that story is going to hit you right when you should be writing anything but.
And then when you start writing that one,
Yeah.
it'll be something else.
Yes.
It's a form of procrastination,
Yeah.
isn't it?
I mean, people say to me, and I do talk to at schools as well, and often children say, "What's your favourite book that you've written?" And I always say, it's always the same answer, and it's the next one, because it's the creative process that inspires me. That's what excites me. By the time a book's been published, I've probably read it at least 4 times, and I've got so many other ideas I want to explore. It's always the next one, and that's what keeps me writing.
Any more questions? Anyone else got anything to ask? Then, I'm going to give you a little time sign. And, sorry, we have one more question. Is that okay?
This one's for Pat Caterpillar, if I may.
Okay.
You are the Don of cyberpunk. How do you feel about that as a genre? Because nowadays it's often lovingly referred to as the future as seen from the 1980s. So if you go swimming in the cyberpunk world, do you find yourself changing your approach to it?
Well, the thing is, I've always written what I write, you know, and other people call it names, but I still write what I write, and people ask me, you know, hey, is cyberpunk dead? And